Here's a truth most men won't admit, and society rarely teaches. People don't say yes because they're convinced by logic, reason, or fairness. They say yes because their mind has been triggered, nudged, and subtly guided, often before they even realize it. And this isn't a moral judgment. It's a reality of human behavior that every man ignoring is losing out on influence, opportunity, and control in life, relationships, and business. The world pretends decisions are rational. Ads, speeches, and advice columns teach that presenting facts, being honest, or showing effort will naturally persuade people. But here's the controversial truth. Facts are secondary. Emotions, perceptions, and triggers are primary. Your ability to make people say yes depends less on what you say and more on how you make them feel, consciously or unconsciously. And most men, they get it wrong. They try to reason, explain, or justify. Meanwhile, the world responds to subtle cues, psychological nudges, and invisible triggers. Let me be blunt. If you're still trying to convince people with logic alone, you're wasting your energy. You're fighting a battle you will never win. Influence isn't won by arguments. It's won by understanding human psychology, the hidden levers that make people act, react, and obey without realizing why. And here's the uncomfortable part. These triggers work on everyone, even the smartest, most rational people. That includes women, colleagues, friends, clients, anyone whose yes matters to you. The first thing men need to understand is that influence is not inherently unethical. It's about awareness. When you understand the triggers that make people say yes, you gain clarity over interactions, decisions, and relationships. You stop being reactive and start being strategic. You stop hoping people will do what you want and begin understanding why they naturally would. And let's be real, most men are completely blind to these mechanisms. They over-explain themselves. They over-apologize. They over-assume that honesty, effort, and patience alone will create compliance. They don't. The world doesn't respond to effort. It responds to psychological triggers. Now, here's the controversial insight. Men who ignore these triggers are handing away power without realizing it. They wonder why people resist their ideas, why partners don't commit, or why opportunities slip through their fingers. Meanwhile, the men who understand influence, who know the subtle levers of human behavior, quietly guide interactions, create alignment, and get consistent yes without appearing pushy, desperate, or manipulative. It's not magic. It's psychology. Let's break it down even further. Humans respond predictably when certain triggers are activated. Scarcity, urgency, social proof, authority, reciprocity. These are not just marketing terms. These are deep psychological principles that dictate how people decide, act, and comply. And here's where most men fail. They ignore these triggers in daily life, assuming people will respond to reason, consistency, or good intentions. But influence rarely works that way. People respond to cues that bypass reasoning and hit directly at instinct, perception, and desire. Think about it. When was the last time you said yes to something because it was perfectly logical? Chances are it was rare. Most yes happen because the situation triggered a feeling, a fear of missing out, a sense of obligation, or a desire to align with social norms. That's why some men are consistently successful with persuasion, sales, or relationships while others, who are just as sincere, fail. It's not skill, effort, or morality. It's psychological awareness. Here's another uncomfortable fact. These triggers can be subtle, invisible, and entirely unintentional. You don't need to be manipulative to activate them. In fact, most people do it naturally. The difference is that men who understand these mechanisms do it deliberately, ethically, and strategically. They don't over-explain themselves. They don't beg for approval. They don't assume honesty alone creates compliance. Instead, they understand perception, timing, and instinct, and they influence outcomes without confrontation or force. Controversy aside, this is a wake-up call. If you're struggling to get agreement, cooperation, or commitment, it's not because you're weak, insufficient, or unlucky. It's because you're ignoring the psychological triggers that dictate human behavior. You're operating in a world of intention when everyone else is operating in the world of perception. You're appealing to logic when humans respond to instinct. And the longer you remain blind to this, the more energy you waste trying to convince people to say yes, while others who understand psychology achieve the same outcomes with subtle precision. By the end of this video, you're going to learn the hidden triggers that make people comply, agree, and say yes, often without conscious awareness. You're going to understand how scarcity, authority, reciprocity, urgency, and emotional cues dictate decisions in ways most men ignore. And most importantly, you'll begin seeing interactions, negotiations, and relationships through a lens of cause and effect, influence and reaction, rather than hope and chance. So, pay attention, because most men never see this coming. They try to convince, explain, or justify, and fail. Meanwhile, influence is being exercised all around them, subtly, predictably, and powerfully. And here's the controversial takeaway to remember from this introduction. If you don't understand psychological triggers, you're already being influenced without realizing it, and most of the time, it's not in your favor. 1. Scarcity, the trigger that makes people act fast. Let's start with one of the most powerful psychological triggers, scarcity. This isn't a subtle principle. It's the reason why people suddenly feel urgency, make decisions quickly, and often say yes before thinking twice. Scarcity works because humans instinctively value what is limited. When something feels rare or exclusive, the brain interprets it as high value and suddenly desire an action spike. Most men fail to realize how often scarcity shows up in everyday interactions and how little they leverage it themselves. Scarcity is not just about limited items in stores or only 5 seats left messages online. It exists in time, attention, opportunities, and even emotional availability. People respond to scarcity because it taps into a deep survival mechanism. If a resource is limited, the risk of missing out triggers action. Here's a critical insight for men. Your presence, attention, and choices are scarce resources. The moment you make them appear endless, people undervalue them, take them for granted, or ignore them completely. Conversely, when you present them with awareness of their limited availability, you increase their perceived value, naturally nudging compliance, engagement, and yes. Think about a situation with a colleague or friend who always makes themselves available. At first, you might appreciate it. Over time, though, your sense of urgency diminishes. Their availability is no longer a privilege. It's expected. Now imagine someone who is selective, consistent, but not always immediately available. Their interactions carry weight. You feel noticed when you get their attention. You value their time more. Scarcity creates focus, respect, and desire, and it works in everyday life as powerfully as in marketing psychology. Here's a real-life scenario to make this concrete. A man wants his ideas or suggestions accepted at work. If he's always immediately available, constantly agreeing, and endlessly accommodating, colleagues may overlook his input. The perceived value of his contribution diminishes. But if he frames his time and attention as limited, responding thoughtfully but selectively, engaging when it matters most, suddenly people pay attention, listen carefully, and are more likely to say yes to his suggestions. The scarcity of his engagement transforms his presence from ordinary to influential. Scarcity is also critical in relationships. Men often make the mistake of being fully available, emotionally or physically, at all times. This constant presence feels reassuring, but it inadvertently signals low leverage. Humans respond to what is limited, and when something is endless, it is subconsciously devalued. By being intentionally selective, men can create natural interest and alignment without manipulation. The scarcity doesn't have to be dramatic. It's the subtle absence, the thoughtful boundaries, and the measured engagement that create perceived value and elicit yes. Another layer of scarcity is time-limited opportunities. People respond faster when decisions have implicit or explicit time constraints. This triggers urgency, an automatic, instinctive reaction to act before the chance disappears. It's why marketing messages emphasize limited time offers or while supplies last. It's not trickery. It's understanding how human psychology works. The same principle applies in everyday life. A man who presents opportunities, whether social, professional, or personal, as meaningful but not always guaranteed, creates natural motivation for others to engage. Scarcity also intersects with confidence and boundaries. When you make your decisions, attention, and priorities visible as intentionally finite, you communicate self-respect and value without saying a word. People respond not because of pressure, persuasion, or coercion, but because scarcity inherently increases perceived worth. In other words, your yes becomes something earned rather than freely given. And when it's earned, compliance is deeper and more genuine. This is where most men fail. They confuse overavailability with reliability and consistency with influence. Being endlessly accessible may seem noble or committed, but actually diminishes leverage. Scarcity, when applied thoughtfully, creates alignment and naturally encourages people to agree, engage, and say yes, often before reasoning even enters a picture. The takeaway is simple but often ignored. Scarcity is a trigger that makes people act quickly and genuinely value what they receive. Whether it's attention, time, opportunities, or personal engagement, scarcity amplifies perceived worth and naturally increases compliance. Men who understand this principle stop over-explaining themselves, stop giving endlessly without regard for boundaries, and start shaping interactions with intentional presence and selective availability. In practice, applying scarcity doesn't mean being cold, manipulative, or unreachable. It means understanding the value of your time, attention, and choices, and using that awareness to guide interactions strategically. When applied ethically, scarcity is not coercion. It's a psychological lever that aligns attention, respect, and willingness naturally. In summary, scarcity is one of the most powerful triggers that make people say yes. Humans respond instinctively to what is limited, rare, or exclusive. Men who overgive, overexplain, or overcommit often lose influence because their presence becomes taken for granted. By being mindful of boundaries, availability, and opportunities, men can naturally increase engagement, respect, and yes, without pressure, manipulation, or drama. 2. Reciprocity. Why giving makes people say yes. Let's talk about one of the most overlooked psychological triggers, reciprocity. This is a principle so powerful, yet most men underestimate it completely. At its core, reciprocity is simple. Humans naturally feel compelled to return favors, kindness, or gestures of help. When someone gives something, time, attention, assistance, or even a small gesture, the other person unconsciously wants to balance the scales. This isn't manipulation. It's human psychology, baked into how we operate socially. Men often miss this because they think influence comes from talking more, explaining more, or trying harder. They over-explain, over-promise, and over-effort, assuming that honesty, effort, or hard work alone will create compliance. But influence doesn't work that way. People respond to subtle triggers that create emotional or cognitive pressure to reciprocate. Reciprocity isn't about keeping score or expecting payment. It's about understanding that giving naturally encourages alignment. Think about your daily interactions. How often do you feel obligated to respond when someone goes out of their way for you? That sense of obligation, even if mild, is reciprocity in action. It's automatic. It doesn't matter if the act is small, seemingly insignificant, or casual. Humans feel the need to match effort, kindness, or attention. That's why men who understand this trigger can create influence without force. They recognize a natural flow, give a little, observe responses, and allow others to naturally align with them. Here's what's crucial. Reciprocity doesn't require grand gestures. It doesn't require overextending yourself. The power is in subtle, thoughtful giving, enough to create a sense of value, consideration, or support. People respond to signals, not obligations. Men often try to force influence through explanations, pressure, or argumentation, ignoring that the natural law of reciprocity is far stronger than any logical appeal. People feel compelled to return gestures of goodwill, and this compulsion often leads to yes before reasoning even comes into play. The tricky part is awareness. Men who overgive without boundaries or overexplain their intentions risk reversing the effect. When everything is given freely without thought or selectivity, people may stop noticing, stop valuing, or stop responding. Influence isn't about generosity alone. It's about strategically creating conditions where reciprocation feels natural. It's about understanding that humans respond to perceived value, not effort. Reciprocity is not just transactional. It's relational. When applied effectively, it builds trust, rapport, and alignment, all without pressure. People want to match what they receive. They respond to the energy, attention, and value presented to them. And when men understand this, they stop exhausting themselves trying to convince others. They stop over-explaining, or over-justifying. They recognize that influence flows naturally when reciprocity is allowed to work, subtly, consistently, and strategically. Another key insight is timing. Reciprocity works best when it is natural, timely, and proportionate. Overgiving early can overwhelm or devalue the interaction. Giving too late can be ignored. The men who master influence understand rhythm and balance. They create opportunities for reciprocation that feel seamless, effortless, and authentic. This isn't about manipulation. It's about understanding human behavior and working with it rather than against it. Many men fail to recognize the subtle psychological rules in play. They assume compliance comes from logic, fairness, or moral reasoning, forgetting that humans are wired to respond emotionally and socially first. Reciprocity is one of the most consistent triggers for yes, because it bypasses argumentation and appeals directly to instinctive social norms. It works in professional settings, personal interactions, and even casual social situations. Recognizing it is a difference between influence that is ignored and influence that naturally gains agreement. The lesson is clear. Influence flows most easily when you understand the principle of reciprocity. Giving strategically, thoughtfully, and with awareness creates alignment naturally. People respond, not because they're being forced, but because their brain perceives fairness, balance, and social obligation. Humans want to return gestures that hold value, and men who understand this trigger can create yes without pressure, arguments, or manipulation. To summarize this section, reciprocity is a silent, powerful driver of human behavior. It works because humans feel compelled to respond to gestures, attention, or consideration. Men who overlook this are often frustrated when their efforts don't yield results. Men who understand it gain influence without effort or force. By giving thoughtfully, maintaining boundaries, and allowing others to naturally reciprocate, yes becomes more frequent, alignment becomes easier, and influence flows seamlessly. 3. Social proof. Stop being blind to influence around you. Here's a harsh truth that many men refuse to admit. Most of us are easily influenced without even realizing it. We like to think our decisions are independent, that our choices are purely logical, and that other people's behavior has little impact on us. But the reality is far more uncomfortable. Humans are wired to follow patterns, trends, and the behaviors of others. This is called social proof, and ignoring it is one of the biggest blind spots for men trying to influence others. Social proof is simple to understand. People look at what others do to guide their own decisions. If everyone around them agrees, invests, or supports something, they are more likely to say yes. If no one is paying attention, the same person hesitates, questions, or ignores the opportunity. And most men, they are oblivious to how this invisible force shapes outcomes in relationships, business, and daily interactions. Here's the uncomfortable part. Many men spend their energy overthinking, over-explaining, or over-performing, believing that effort alone will create agreement. They try to reason people into yes, when the truth is, people take cues from what others do before they consider what you say. You could be articulate, persuasive, and confident, but if the signals around your idea, presence, or value don't align with what people see others doing, you will struggle to get compliance. Now, let's be honest, this is a wake-up call. Men often underestimate how powerful social proof is. They assume influence comes from talking more, trying harder, or being nice. They ignore patterns of human behavior that operate below the surface. They fail to observe that people follow behaviors they perceive as accepted, popular, or validated by the group. And while they remain blind, influence flows around them. To the men who understand social dynamics and subtly leverage them to gain yes naturally. Here's the criticism you need to hear. If you're frustrated that your opinions, suggestions, or desires are ignored, the problem isn't always external. It's not that people are unreasonable or that life is unfair. The problem is that you haven't positioned yourself within the right context to create alignment. You haven't recognized the invisible patterns that drive compliance. You assume influence is personal, when in reality it's social. Humans are social creatures. We respond to what the group signals as acceptable, valuable, or desirable. Wake up. Being good, honest, or logical isn't enough. People look at what others value, endorse, or approve of before they decide for themselves. This doesn't mean copying others or being fake. It means being aware of human behavior, group dynamics, and perception. Influence isn't just about you. It's about how people interpret your actions in the context of the environment, the group, and the signals around them. Social proof is everywhere. It's in who pays attention, who reacts, who engages first. It's in subtle cues, body language, enthusiasm, and alignment with existing norms. Ignoring it is like trying to swim upstream against a current you can't see. You can expend endless energy, but without awareness, you will always struggle to get yes. Men who understand this principle don't manipulate. They observe patterns, adjust their presence, and let influence follow naturally. Here's the advice every man needs. Stop trying to force agreement with sheer effort or logic alone. Start observing patterns. Notice where attention flows, who sets the tone, and how actions influence perception. Align your presence, timing, and behavior with the flow of social proof. When people see others responding positively to you, they are more likely to follow. Not because you forced it, but because you create an environment where yes feels natural, safe, and almost inevitable. The subtle criticism here is clear. Men often struggle because they fight against human psychology instead of working with it. They assume effort alone wins respect or compliance. They ignore invisible forces like social proof that guide human behavior every single day. The wake-up call is this. Stop being blind, start being aware, and position yourself strategically in your social environment. Influence doesn't belong to those who try hardest. It belongs to those who understand the rules of the game. Ultimately, social proof teaches a simple but profound lesson. Humans respond to patterns, trends, and perceived consensus. Men who ignore this principle waste energy trying to convince people one by one. Men who understand it gain yes naturally, effortlessly, and repeatedly. Your challenge is to see the world as it operates, influenced, patterned, and socially driven, and to adjust your approach accordingly. Awareness, alignment, and observation are far more powerful than over-explanation or brute effort. By embracing social proof, you stop struggling to persuade, stop chasing validation, and stop being ignored. Instead, you become a man who commands attention, earns alignment, and creates yes without force, simply by understanding how humans respond to behavior of others. Here's the part most men don't want to hear, but desperately need. It's not your effort, your explanations, or your intentions that make people say yes. It's your understanding of human psychology, and most men are blind to it. You've been taught that honesty, hard work, and being nice automatically earn agreement, respect, or attention. That's a comforting story, but it's false. The world doesn't operate on comfort. It operates on perception, patterns, and triggers that most people never consciously notice. Many men spend years over-explaining themselves, justifying decisions, and try to reason people into saying yes. They assume effort alone equals influence. Here's the uncomfortable truth. It doesn't. People don't respond to your intentions. They respond to signals. They don't respond to your explanations. They respond to perception. And they don't respond to your effort. They respond to your strategic alignment with how human behavior actually works. This is controversial because it challenges one of the most widely held beliefs about human interaction, that being good, honest, or hardworking is enough. It isn't. Niceness does not equal influence. Transparency does not guarantee agreement. Effort does not create compliance. Men who rely on these assumptions are wasting time and energy, and it's invisible to them. Meanwhile, those who understand psychological triggers, scarcity, reciprocity, social proof, consistently get yes, influence outcomes, and gain alignment effortlessly. Let me be direct. If you're frustrated that people ignore you, say no to your ideas, or fail to follow through, the fault isn't always external. It's not that people are unfair, unkind, or unreasonable. It's that you haven't mastered the underlying mechanisms that govern human behavior. You haven't recognized the invisible rules that create yes, attention, and agreement. You've been playing a game you didn't know existed. And that's why you keep losing. Now here's the wake-up call. Understanding human behavior isn't unethical, manipulative, or cruel. It's necessary. The ability to influence people, gain alignment, and elicit yes is a skill. And like any skill, it requires awareness, observation, and practice. Ignoring it doesn't make you morally superior. It makes you powerless. Most men are comfortable being powerless because it's safe to assume effort alone should work. But comfort doesn't create results. Awareness does. I want to hear from you. Think about your life, your work, your relationships. How often do you over-explain yourself? How often do you give endlessly without boundaries? How often do you assume effort equals results? Share your experiences in the comments. I read every message. I pay attention. And when I can, I reach out to connect with you directly. This channel isn't about preaching from above. It's about exploring patterns together, learning what works, and understanding the hidden psychology that shapes human behavior every single day. The controversial truth is this. Most men are ignored, overlooked, or dismissed not because they lack value, but because their value is poorly communicated, unknowingly and unconsciously. You could be brilliant, talented, and capable, yet if your actions, present, and understanding of human psychology are misaligned with how people respond, you will struggle to get yes. That's why influence is not a reward for being nice. It's a consequence of understanding the patterns that govern human behavior and applying them consistently. Here's the final advice. Stop trying to convince people of your worth. Stop over-explaining. Stop giving endlessly without boundaries. Observe. Understand. Apply. Let scarcity, reciprocity, and social proof work naturally. Influence is not force. It's alignment. And when you align correctly, yes comes without struggle, attention follows without chasing, and respect builds without effort. This isn't theory. It's reality. It's uncomfortable because it exposes a gap between effort and outcome, intention and perception, hard work and influence. But it's also liberating. Once you understand it, you stop wasting energy, you start gaining control, and you start seeing results that were always possible. You just didn't know the rules. So, comment below. Share what you've noticed about when people say yes or no in your life. Share situations where effort failed despite your best intentions. I'll read them. I'll connect. And together, we'll explore these hidden psychological patterns. Because the truth is uncomfortable, but awareness is power, and power comes not from being nice, but from understanding what actually works. Remember this. Your value doesn't get recognized automatically. It gets signaled, perceived, and strategically understood. Stop being frustrated by invisible rules. Start mastering them. Stop chasing validation. Start observing influence. And watch as yes begins to follow naturally, consistently, and inevitably.